We'll make it work one way or another. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ongoing lecture series on faith and science here in Oak Ridge. We're here at First Presbyterian Church doing this series for about 15 years now, I believe. It started for us as the Davidson Lecture many years ago. And I think right before COVID, we joined up with the Methodists, who've also been doing similar series over the years, and now have been in partnership for the last 3 or 4 years now, doing this every 6 months or so as an alternating forum on science and faith. And this year we had hoped to have Jim with us in person, but for various and sundry reasons that did not work out. So we're doing it via Zoom. And Jim, a little background on Jim Antal. He has been a pastor of the United Church of Christ for many years, starting with congregations in the Midwest and the Northeast. And then for a dozen years or so, I'm gonna get your title wrong, Jim. You were president and something.
I was minister and president of the Massachusetts Conference for 400 churches.
Yeah, he had about 350 churches under him at that point. He has since retired and is now serving a similar role on climate justice for the entire United Church of Christ, working with the president and whatever other title that guy had. I know the Presbyterian titles, I don't know the UCC titles. So Jim, in spite of the fact of nominally being retired, is still extremely active in working on climate change and also on the right to vote, the sacred right to vote, which some of you at the Methodist Church heard about a little bit this morning, and some of you at the Presbyterian Church also heard a little bit about. So at this point in this lecture, Jim's going to be talking more about climate and climate crisis and how the church should respond to it. And Jim, I lost my notes, otherwise I'd give the title that you gave us, but I'm going to let you just take it away and go from here. So Jim Antal, let's welcome Jim.
Well, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Dan and to the other organizers of this gathering. And for those of you from the Methodist Church, we had a wonderful time together earlier this morning in Sunday school. And I also want to give a special thanks to both the Methodist Church and for those of you there right now for allowing the format to shift to Zoom so that I can continue my, I guess, unsurprising recovery from COVID. I'd like to ask that we begin with a moment of silent prayer for all the communities that have been devastated by Hurricane Helene, and also for all the people caught up in the unthinkable violence of war in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Israel, in the West Bank, and in the Ukraine. Let us be in a spirit of prayer. Also assure you that you're not alone when it comes to people of faith wanting to engage the climate crisis. In the last year, and in fact, in the last year alone, I should say, I've been addressing over 25 such gatherings in 14 different states. When the climate movement began back in 2007, I would remind congregations that one of the reasons our church buildings have steeples is to be able to alert the town to an emergency by sounding the alarm, usually in the form of ringing the bell in the church steeple. Today, we're gathered because we have heard that alarm, and we want to come together to respond to the greatest moral challenge humanity has ever faced. Let me also invite you during my presentation to jot down your questions so that I might respond to them, because that's a top priority for our time together. Obviously, I think what I have to say is important, but much more important for me is to be able to do my best to respond to your questions and to listen to your comments. Addressing climate change is an enormous challenge. The topic is so big, the problem so overwhelming. It's helpful to have some guidance. So with that in mind, I'm going to break it down into 7 steps. It's not a sequence. Different people will follow different ones of these steps in their own way. But I think that each step is important and perhaps essential. So let's get started. First of all, fall in love with God's creation. Living as you do in a state with so many beautiful places, falling in love with God's creation is perhaps the easiest step. Every single day, perhaps multiple times each day, I want to encourage you to simply take a breath and allow yourself to be grateful for the beauty, the diversity, and the grandeur that surrounds you. That's the first step. Fall in love with creation. Here's the second step. Recognize the assault and realize the threat. Let me illustrate why it's urgent that we take action on climate immediately. It's been over 125,000 years since the Earth has been as warm as it was in 2023. And for the first time, the 12-month period that ended in February exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Scientists have warned that if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world's tropics could become uninhabitable. 2.5 billion people live in the tropics. On August 7th, the temperature reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit above the Arctic Circle. That same day, Florida was only 92 degrees. In Miami and Canada, in countries around the Mediterranean, the fires have raged like a blowtorch. Over the past year, the oceans off southern Florida rivaled the hot tubs at the resorts as they hit 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Our oceans are warming at a rate almost half again as fast as we thought only 5 years ago. We now know that air pollution caused by the burning of fossil fuel kills almost 9 million people a year. That's more than malaria, HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. And that doesn't even include the lives lost due to the impact of increased global warming. 70% of CO2 pollution comes from the richest 20% of the people in the world. Since 1950, the number of floods across the world has increased by 15 times, extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires by 7-fold. A quarter of the world's population is one drought away from running out of water. The Greenland ice sheet is now melting 7 times faster than it was in the 1990s. In other words, the past decade has been the hottest decade since records have been kept, and the past decade will be the coolest decade your children and your grandchildren will ever experience. With all of this in mind, UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres recently said, "Climate breakdown has begun. Our climate is imploding faster than we can cope with. Extreme weather events hitting every corner of the planet. Surging temperatures demand a surge in action." Pope Francis, of course, agrees. In his landmark 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis wrote that we have turned the earth, our common home, into an immense pile of filth. And last year, on St. Francis of Assisi Day, more or less 1 year ago, Pope Francis released Laudato Deum, a follow-up to Laudato Si, and in it, he calls for, and I'm quoting, the abandonment of fossil fuels. And he also explicitly commends climate activists. Rather than offer more illustrations, let me provide some perspective. If you look back in time at the Earth's climate, you'll see that it's only been over the past 10,000 years, about 400 generations, that the climate has provided humanity with a stable enough pattern for people to depend on. In fact, it's that dependable climate that allowed humanity to settle down, to farm our own food, and to live in year-round communities. Thus, civilization emerges from and depends upon a stable climate, or what I like to call the continuity of God's creation. But that continuity is now broken. Once the industrial era began, it took us only 7 generations to decreate the planet. Over the past 200 years, humanity has extracted and burned about half the coal, oil, and gas that nature took 150 million years to make. That's how the developed countries built the modern world. In doing so, a tiny percentage of us became unimaginably wealthy, providing the control over and profiting from the control over and the abuse of resources that have had nothing to do with us creating them. At the same time, a majority of people in the world are living amidst increased inequality, poverty, hunger, homelessness, and lack of potable water. These injustices are all casualties of the unjust acquisition, extraction, distribution, and profit from the energy stored under our feet. And to address these injustices, humanity must complete the greatest transition we have ever attempted, moving from our dependency on fossil fuel to a reliance on renewable and sustainable forms of clean energy. So what's been holding us back? As we'll see in a minute, the solutions are all available today. So why haven't politicians, industry leaders, and consumers embraced these solutions? What's been keeping us from making the necessary transitions? Here, a little history is helpful. Way back in 1965, when President Johnson received the first report on global warming, he responded by saying, and I quote, "The destiny of humanity and the rest of creation are intimately linked. We flourish and perish together." In 1970, the first Earth Day saw 20 million Americans take to the streets. It took only a few months for Congress to create the Environmental Protection Agency and pass the Clean Air Act, which President Nixon signed. 2 years later, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and a year after that, Congress passed the Endangered Species Act. And it's worth remembering that in 2006, President George W. Bush, the former oil man from Texas, declared, and I'm quoting, "America is addicted to oil," and insisted that the United States break this addiction. So if presidents of both parties express these kinds of concern, something else must be causing our inaction. Of course, there are many factors, but the driving reason we have not broken our addiction to fossil fuels is that since their inception, fossil fuel corporations have had one and only one goal: to make the most money for their shareholders each quarter. Keeping that goal in mind, here's some additional history. In 1975, when the fossil fuel corporations heard that the world was on the brink of global warming, they quickly hired the best climate scientists in the world. As early as 1977, those scientists told the board of Exxon that climate change is caused by humans burning fossil fuel. It's getting worse. And while the oceans are absorbing most of the excess CO2, that will not continue indefinitely. A new study from 2023 shows that as far back as 1977, the oil companies predicted exactly the global warming impacts we see today. But instead of releasing those reports, Exxon hired the best ocean scientists and asked them if the oceans were saving us by absorbing the excess CO2. And in the mid 1980s, the ocean scientists confirmed those findings. At about the same time, Exxon's engineers reported a breakthrough in their ability to drill horizontally through shale. This allowed Exxon to extract more natural gas than anyone could imagine, what we today refer to as fracking. So what did Exxon do? First, they fired those climate scientists and buried their reports. And then Exxon hired a few fake scientists, the same fake scientists that the tobacco industry had hired in 1978. Just as those fake scientists had sown the seeds of doubt about whether or not smoking caused cancer, they began to sow the seeds of doubt about whether climate change was real. Over the past 4.5 decades, fossil fuel corporations and their think tank partners have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on various disinformation campaigns and supporting politicians who do their bidding. To this day, America remains the only place in the world where climate denial has any political or cultural traction. To learn more about this, I highly recommend that you watch the documentary Merchants of Doubt, which thoroughly examines the issue of science denial funded by fossil fuel companies. The documentary is based on a book by the same title, Merchants of Doubt, by my friend and Harvard professor, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. You could also watch a recent 3-part PBS Frontline series called The Power of Big Oil. Now that we understand the assault on God's creation, as difficult as it may be, we must take the third step. We must allow ourselves to feel the pain. Serving as a guide for this difficult task is someone whose name you've all heard, Greta Thunberg. Greta first heard about the climate crisis when she was 8 years old. What she saw while watching several educational movies affected her greatly. Looking back, she reports, and I'm quoting, "I began thinking about it all the time, and I became very sad." Such was her pain that over the next few years, she fell into depression. She talked to very few people beyond her family. And for the most part, she stopped eating. And as a consequence of that, she stopped growing. Eventually, what made her begin to feel better were her parents. Greta felt like they really heard her. They didn't try to erase the pain. Instead, they demonstrated their solidarity by no longer eating meat and becoming vegans. In 2016, Greta's mother showed her support by taking another more major step. As a well-known opera singer, her career depended on traveling far and wide. After listening to her daughter's critique of flying as a major contributor to the climate crisis, Greta's mother stopped flying. Because she was well known, her no-fly decision drew a lot of attention. Over the next 2 years, she and her husband would write a book about how Greta had changed them. In the fall of 2018, 15-year-old Greta Thunberg skipped school and headed for the sidewalk in front of the Swedish parliament, where she sat down holding her hand-painted sign that read, "School Strike for Climate." A few days later, others joined her. By November 2018, more than 17,000 students in 24 countries had taken part at what had become known as Fridays for the Future. When TEDx in Stockholm invited 15-year-old Greta to address their audience, imagine that, a 15-year-old doing her own TEDx. And what did she do? She shared the pain she had felt since first learning about the climate crisis when she was 8. She told the audience that from her study of the science, it was clear to her that everything had to change. And she concluded by recognizing that people need hope and affirmed that once we start to act, hope is everywhere. I want to just mention a very different example of a well-known person who recently, much to his own surprise, allowed himself to feel the pain of the cry of creation. At age 90, in 2022, the captain of Starship Enterprise, William Shatner, became the oldest person to travel into space. As it turns out, the experience left him, and I quote, with overwhelming sadness. He wrote, and I quote, "Every day we are confronted with the knowledge of further destruction of Earth at our hands, the extinction of animal species, of flora and fauna, things that took 5 billion years to evolve. And suddenly we will never see them again because of the interference of mankind. It filled me with dread." Shatner exemplifies another one of Greta's brilliant insights. Greta tells us hope starts with honesty. As both Shatner and Greta exemplify, honesty involves talking about your sadness, your grief, your love of nature, your heartbreak over the fact that we're destroying God's creation. Evangelical Christian and climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe says that talking about the climate crisis may be the most important thing an individual can do. It's my experience that the smoke of grief and the fire of love are inseparable. For anyone who loves life, who loves their children, or delights in the natural world, recognizing the realities of climate change will trigger grief. And as you allow yourself to experience the pain, you may find yourself feeling a new and confusing emotion. More and more people are feeling a sadness or a grief over the loss of places they regard as home. The word for this new emotion is solastalgia. Let's make sure that our houses of worship are safe enough places for us to honestly share our grief, and by doing so, give rise to a life of hope and action. Now we take the fourth step. For the past few minutes, I've been focusing on the importance of allowing ourselves to feel the pain. It's only natural that as you allow yourself to feel the pain, you'll want to attend to the source of your pain. So let me share a story, a parable of sorts, that explains what I mean when I say we need to attend to the source of our pain. Here's the parable. One day, in the quiet life of a village that stood on the edge of a river, their life was interrupted by a scream. While sitting on a park bench alongside a river, a woman saw a bleeding body floating down the rapids. Several people responded, jumped into the river, pulled the person out, and attended to that person's injuries. A while later, someone saw another body in the river. That person called for help, jumped into the river, grabbed the arm, and with help, pulled the second body from the river. Over the next few hours, the good people of this village pulled several more bodies out of the river and did their best to attend to them. The mayor called for a town meeting, and when the townspeople assembled in the town square, a teenager interrupted the mayor. She shouted out, "I'm going upstream. Who is coming with me? We need to stop these assaults. We need to confront the source of these attacks and put an end to them." Since 2011, the climate movement has been driven more and more by young people, people of color, and indigenous people, and all of them have been shouting, "We need to go upstream. We need to focus our attention on the supply side of the crisis." And the climate movement has been doing just that. Beginning in 2011, we focused on stopping fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. Since then, not only was the Keystone XL pipeline canceled, so were dozens of other unnecessary pipelines, and hundreds of coal-fired power plants were closed. In 2012, the climate movement began to call for divestment from fossil fuel corporations. In 2013, my denomination, the United Church of Christ, led the way in this effort. When the UCC passed a resolution that I wrote, we became the first religious organization and the first national organization to vote to divest. And in only 11 years, portfolios worth over $40 trillion, that's trillion with a T, have divested their holdings of fossil fuel stock. Pope Francis also recognized that it was time to confront the source of the problem. In 2018 and 2019, he convened the CEOs of the world's largest fossil fuel corporations and tried to call them to account. And on the 5th anniversary of the release of Laudato Si, Pope Francis called on all Catholic institutions to divest from fossil fuels. In October 2023, Pope Francis' newest papal letter called for the abandonment of fossil fuels and also explicitly commends climate activists. Because fossil fuel companies continue to do all they can to expand their infrastructure so that they can extract still more fossil fuel, they need funding. And this has birthed another supply side campaign. It goes by many names: Stop the Money Pipeline, Banking on Our Future, Defund Climate Chaos, Discredit Bad Banks. This past summer, over the course of 13 weeks, thousands of activists, including scores of faith leaders, initiated 87 protests in front of Citibank World Headquarters in New York City. 28 of these actions involved civil disobedience, and over 700 activists were arrested. We called it the Summer of Heat campaign. Citibank, along with JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, these four banks alone, since the passage of the Paris Climate Accord in 2016, these four banks have lent over $1.4 trillion to fossil fuel companies to expand their fossil fuel production. As Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. In April 2022, over 1,000 scientists risked arrest by putting their bodies on the line in over 25 countries as they sounded the alarm about the urgency and injustice of the climate crisis. My friend, NASA scientist Peter Kalmus, was among them. He was arrested at Chase Bank in Pasadena, protesting Chase Bank's funding of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And you may have heard about or even met Rose Abramoff, who worked as a scientist at Oak Ridge National Labs and was one of the authors of the United Nations IPCC report. Abramoff decided that she needed to take more concrete action. So in April 2022, she chained herself to the White House fence, something I've done several times, during a climate protest. In December, she participated in a climate protest at the world's largest Earth Sciences conference. In January 2023, she was fired from her job at Oak Ridge National Laboratory for participating in a climate protest, thus making her the first climate scientist to lose her job for a climate protest. Imagine if universities stopped funding from fossil fuel companies to conduct climate research. Over 500 academics from many of the most prestigious universities have demanded just that. What if the fossil fuel industry was unable to find a PR firm or an advertising agency to spin the fossil fuel industry's false and deceptive narratives that seek to misinform the public? A new organization called Clean Creatives is an effort to convince PR and advertising agencies to stop working with the fossil fuel industry. Over 65 cities, as well as the states of California and Massachusetts, have passed laws banning gas stoves, gas furnaces, and other gas appliances in new construction. Another way to weaken the source of the climate crisis is to expose the 100 elite law firms, which have facilitated an almost inconceivable $2.89 trillion in fossil fuel transactions. They've represented oil and gas corporations in over 518 cases and received nearly $33 million to lobby for fossil fuel interests. There's an organization called Law Students for Climate Accountability that's now working to hold them accountable. So for our fifth step, it's essential that we celebrate the progress we've made. 78% of Americans agree that we have a moral responsibility to create a safe and healthy environment for ourselves and for our children. Americans who think that global warming is happening outnumber those who think it's not happening by 5-1. And almost 50% of Americans say that people in the United States are being harmed right now by global warming. It's also important to recognize the environmental sea change that occurred in January 2021. Since he took office, President Biden has overturned 98 of former President Trump's deregulation actions, and he is working to roll back another 77. In addition, Biden has approved 111 new policies and is working to add another 73. In the fall of 2021, Congress passed an infrastructure bill that included over $200 billion for climate-related projects. And in August 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA. The $370 billion in the IRA are in the form of tax credits. So if people take full advantage of this opportunity, and they are, America will invest over $1 trillion in climate and energy-related projects. In addition to that funding, the IRA explicitly grants the EPA authority to regulate greenhouse gas pollution, as well as to encourage the transition to clean energy sources, including wind and solar energy. Here's some additional good news. Climate change is now a national security priority for the Pentagon, the Justice Department, the Energy Department, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And they are all now focusing on environmental justice. That prompted Dr. Bob Bullard, who is widely considered to be the father of the environmental justice movement, to say environmental justice is not just a footnote anymore, it's a headline. Across the country, people are beginning to realize what many of you already know, that environmental justice is jobs with justice. Environmental justice is housing justice. Environmental justice is health justice. Environmental justice is indigenous justice. Environmental justice is racial justice. And here's something else we can celebrate. We can do this. We already have the solutions we need to undertake this transition. A group of the world's top climate scientists recently issued a report indicating that by 2030, electricity from solar, wind, and water could provide all the electricity the world needs. And by 2035, renewable energy could be the sole energy source for all the world's heating, cooling, transportation, and industry. A new study out of Stanford shows that by 2035, clean energy, along with battery and hydrogen storage, could provide all the energy we're using now at a much cheaper cost. In fact, another new study indicates that making this transition will pay for itself in only 6 years. Not only that, but as we make this transition, we can address economic and racial inequalities, and by doing so, we will reap benefits far greater than the costs. Just as we are celebrating our progress, it's time for our 6th step. It's time to receive God's call. Usually we think of calling or vocation as something that's personal. God may call this individual to pursue one path, and God may call another individual to champion a different passion. And often, as all of you know, the mission of a congregation is shaped by individuals who effectively recruit others to join them in their cause. But this is not the only understanding of calling. When we examine Scripture, it becomes obvious that God also calls communities, not just individuals. Nevertheless, in America, where a centuries-long celebration of individualism persists, the idea that God might be calling an entire congregation or an entire town or an entire nation to come together and embrace a particular mission, such an idea is routinely dismissed. It's as if it never occurred to so many people of faith that God might call us to join in common cause to fulfill God's mission. A call to address the climate crisis is a communal call, a universal call. Living as we are on the hinge of history, the climate crisis places an inescapable moral claim on our generation and therefore on each of us. It urges our generation to embrace a fresh understanding of human freedom, fulfillment, vocation, and salvation. Can we accept that we are most free when we embrace our interdependence? That we are most fulfilled when we are grateful for having enough? That God's call, our vocation, is to recognize we're all in this together. And that God is offering not just personal salvation, but collective salvation. If we can, we will create an unstoppable mandate to restore creation. There was a time not too long ago when a generation of Americans and our allies recognized solidarity as a survival strategy, a time when they understood the importance of we. That generation realized that World War II placed an inescapable moral claim on them. That moral claim prompted that generation to accept a common, universal calling. More than 40 million individuals sacrificed their lives. Tens of thousands of churches converted their pristine lawns to victory gardens. Tens of millions of Americans became vegetarians so the troops would have enough protein. Recognizing that civilization was at risk, people came together accepting the reality that we don't get to do what we want. We have to do what needs to be done. For this reason and others, the young adults in that generation came to be known as the greatest generation. The God of many names is calling everyone who is alive today to recognize that our generation, no matter what generation we may be part of, that our generation has a vocation, a common, universal calling. It's time for people of faith to make God's call to restore creation and advance climate justice an essential part of our identity so that we can leave a fair and stable planet for our kids and grandkids and for all future generations. It's time for each of us to accept that we often have more influence than we recognize. It's time for us to call upon our gifts, our energy, our time, our skills, our networks, and our assets as we join with others in doing what urgently needs to be done. It's time for our generation to conjure the tireless resolve needed to reverse our current course so that we may restore our common home. Clergy, as well as every community leader, have a special role to play in inspiring their people to initiate this pivot in identity, self-understanding, and vocation. Now for the seventh and final step. It's time to engage your new vocation. Not long after the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 2018 report, an op-ed piece brought just such an invitation to the readers of the New York Times. The headline was striking. Stopping climate change is hopeless. Let's do it. After enumerating many of the most depressing realities of climate change, the authors declare, we're perfect for the job. If the human species specializes in one thing, it's taking on the impossible. We are constitutionally equipped to understand this situation. Now, understanding is one thing, and taking action is another. The authors described how spiritual practice can help us exchange some of our current habits for new practices and disciplines that have the power to be salvific. They believe that the path out of this mess will lead us to become more like a blessed community. The work that is required of us, and now I'm quoting, would endow our lives with some of the oldest and most numinous aspirations of humankind, leading a good life, treating our neighbors well, imbuing our short existence with timeless ideas like grace and dignity, respect and tolerance and love. The authors continue, and I'm quoting again, the climate struggle embodies the essence of what it means to be human, which is that we strive for the divine. Another good news testimony comes from climate scientist Simon Donner, professor of climatology at the University of British Columbia. In his 2022 TEDx talk, Professor Donner invites his audience to recognize that we are living at a moment of immense opportunity. and that using our imagination is key to solving the climate crisis. Because we are living in such anxious times and anxiety can stifle the imagination, it's essential for us to take time to quiet down, to silence the clamor of requests that demand our attention, and to listen to the still small voice of God. And when we do, we might find ourselves in the company of Esther, confronted with the realization that perhaps we were born for just such a time as this. Perhaps our generation was born to put an end to these interconnected systemic injustices, the subjugation of other humans who are not our color, the colonization of land that is not our own, the extraction of nature's wealth that we did not create. Perhaps God is calling our generation to recognize that we really all do live at the same address, with the number 424 parts per million of CO2 emblazoned above every door and every dwelling. At a time of ideological division, perhaps God is calling all humanity to unite as we recognize that we really are all in this together. I believe God is calling our generation to live into a new story, a fossil fuel free story, a story in which we join millions of others as we realign our time, our energy, our gifts, our attention, and our assets to respond to the call now heard around the world. That call can be heard in the streets as thousands of scientists, clergy, young people, and others are protesting, insisting that we end the era of fossil fuel. That call can be heard in the boardrooms of Exxon and other fossil fuel companies as more and more of their stockholders purge their portfolios of fossil fuel holdings, adding to more than $40 trillion that have been divested since 2012. That call can be heard in the courtrooms where fossil fuel companies and pipeline developers and other corporate profiteers are being sued by cities, states, and children for violating their legal rights. That call can be heard on university campuses when they ban the fossil fuel industry from recruiting on campus. And earlier this year, that call was heard by the White House and the Department of Energy when, for the first time in history, it placed a pause on a proposed plan for building new fossil fuel infrastructure. Climate activists, especially those elders affiliated with Bill McKibben's new organization, Third Act, had generated tens of thousands of signatures and were preparing the largest civil disobedience action in U.S. history. To everyone's surprise, the Department of Energy and the White House announced that the proposed liquid natural gas export terminals, 17 of them, would be halted so that their impact on climate change could be evaluated. And just so you understand what that impact would be, if these liquid natural gas export terminals were built, their climate impact would be the equivalent of doubling the number of cars and trucks in America. And to make no mistake about it, the United States is already the largest exporter of liquid natural gas, and the greenhouse gas footprint for liquid natural gas is 1/3 again higher than the greenhouse gas footprint for burning coal. President Biden's decision to pause the building of these liquid natural gas export terminals was the biggest thing a U.S. president has ever done to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. Believing that another, more just world is possible, let us become the generation that finally blows the whistle and declares, "Not on my watch." Let us begin to live into a new story, a story shaped by the unifying power of shared vulnerability, the expansive fullness of interdependence, the contagious generosity of caring for the least of these among us, and our universal calling to protect God's great gift of creation. Thank you, and let the people say Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much for that presentation, Jim. How about a hand for Jim Antal? And now we've got plenty of time for questions, so I hope that people have been writing them down as they occurred to them throughout the course of your presentation. I want to start just by mentioning, Jim, that your comment about the LNG shutdown and the protests that Bill McKibben was planning to structure at the Forrestal building in DC was echoed and supported by a potential protest here in Oak Ridge as well by some of us in the community who are going to basically have a protest in front of the Oak Ridge building, which looks surprisingly like the Forrestal building, except in much smaller footprint. And as we were working towards trying to come to an agreement with the security at that building about how we would manage things, they said, "You're just going to have to be patient with us. We've never done this before." So it was a new experience for them to consider having to respond to something like that as well. So that was kind of
That's great.
questions in the audience. Looks like you convinced everybody, Jim.
Come on, folks. This is your opportunity.
Hey Jim, this is Peggy, and Dan and I often talk about civil disobedience from two different perspectives. I think, would be very willing to get arrested, and I would not. So I wonder how, you're married, right? Are you married? Okay.
Yes.
Do you and your wife have similar discussions about the idea of spending a night in jail? Just curious about that. And how could I be supportive of somebody who may be willing more bravely to do something that I'm not brave enough to do?
So, first of all, I really, really appreciate this question. And I have heard of sort of very similar comments or questions in almost every presentation that I make. So the first thing to say is you're not alone. And secondly, just to affirm the content of what you've said, even people who sort of agree on everything and have spent their lives together, they don't necessarily agree that they feel called, or as we sometimes say in Christian circles, convicted, in terms of a conviction of conscience to go ahead and do civil disobedience. It is one strategy. It is one manifestation of activism. But how shall I put it? Sometimes people who do civil disobedience, and sometimes those who don't do it but look on, they think that somehow there's a hierarchy of commitment, or a hierarchy of being all in on the issue. And I want to immediately say no, that's not how it works. People who support actions are just as important as people who actually take the actions themselves. All are needed in terms of shifting the circumstances we now face. I'll give you an example, just a very concrete example that you might not expect. I can't remember their name, but this is about 2 or 3 years ago, if I remember correctly. There were 3 seats open on the Exxon board of directors, and some venture capitalists who are, you might think are just about as far away from civil disobedience folks as one could be. Some venture capitalists who I think felt as strongly as I do about fossil fuels, they ran for those seats and they actually won. In other words, they had a successful campaign with voters who hold Exxon stock, and they got places on the board. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't appear that, that it was a very effective strategy, at least not so far. But as it turns out, the reason I give that as an example is it's often the case that civil disobedience and other things at first appear ineffective. But if you look at the history of social change, what you realize is that there's all kinds of things that appear ineffective until it is done. Now, I'm paraphrasing Nelson Mandela when I say that, but that was Mandela's point, that for years and decades, everything he and his supporters did seemed to be ineffective until 1990 or 1991, whichever it was. And boom, lo and behold, Nelson Mandela not only out of jail, he becomes president of South Africa. So, that's an example that is, coterminous with our lifetimes. And I could give countless examples from history of that. And I'm convinced that that's the way it's going to be with fossil fuel, and that humanity will look back at this period of time that we're all living in, and just kind of shake their heads. Why couldn't it have happened faster or easier? But as I've suggested in what I have to say, the profit motive is very, very strong. So thank you for that question.
Other questions?
Hi, I have a friend who's a banker, also is concerned about climate change. And so I was telling her about, not using the credit cards of Chase, which was just a simple thing for me to do. She made the comment, and I was just wondering if you ever heard this, her being a banker, that Chase actually at some point in the 2000s said that they would get out of supporting the coal industry. And the state of Texas came back and said, you can't do that because you have a responsibility to your shareholders. Would you comment on that? I mean, so if that were a true statement, then you have 2 points you have to start to tackle.
So your question illustrates the complexity of the situation we are now in, which is that complexity it's kind of complex enough, but then the complexity is intensified or amplified by the increasing ideological divide in our country. The entire notion that it is legitimate to have to create funds that are sensitive to environmental, social, and governance concerns. And governance concerns means, like, for example, having women on your board of directors. That would be a governance concern. So ESG, as many of you know, over the past 2 years, but particularly over the past year and a half, there have been attempts in various states, Texas isn't the only one, essentially to say that creating and promoting ESG funds is somehow illegal. And so I'm not a lawyer, and I can't speak to the technical aspect of that. But what I can say is this, that right now, the enormous profit which fossil fuel companies and their various supporting corporations, the enormous profits that they have been willing to extract from people and also from the earth in terms of their resources. Um, those profits are desperately being held on to. And so anything, whether it's divestment, whether it's ESG alternative funds, or protests or what have you, whether it's the EPA saying that, carbon dioxide is actually a poisonous gas. No matter what, all of that is being pushed back. And the reason is, and I just want to be as clear as possible, that the legal costs to Exxon and the other fossil fuel companies, the legal costs in order to create all of these suits, to initiate all these suits, is utterly trivial. It represents the most tiny percentage of the profits these companies are making from what I would say raping the earth. Um, so so that's the situation that we are in. I can't speak to the specific of your question about Texas and its laws and stuff. The Attorney General of Texas is notorious not only for actions he has taken, but for rounding up other attorney generals from other states to join him in taking actions in fighting climate change. Just one more comment. It's not what you asked, but it's in the spirit of what you're asking, and that is 25 states, I think is the number now. 25 states have now passed legislation making it a major crime if you are protesting at an oil, gas, or coal refinery or protesting a pipeline or other mechanism of delivering fossil fuel. By major crime, I mean, subject to like 2 to 5 years in jail for just doing a protest. Now, as it turns out, if you look at the laws in those 25 states, they all use almost identical wording. Historians have gone back, people who do contemporary history have gone back to the beginning of this effort, which was, my vague recollection is 5 years ago is when this began. And it turns out, I'm not certain that Louisiana was the first state to do this, but some state was the first. It might have been Minnesota. It might have been, Line 5 up in Minnesota. But one of the states that first passed this, then the Heritage Foundation, along with other like-minded foundations, they provide support, and then the fossil fuel companies donate to the Heritage Foundation so that the Heritage Foundation can provide the support for other states to pass the more or less exact same bill that state passed. That's the kind of situation we are now living in terms of what is unambiguously, a fight for, how long will unlimited profits be allowed to benefit shareholders of these companies, at the expense of, children and citizens, who's suffering. Just go over to the next state east of you and ask them about suffering. Whose suffering is just going to get worse and worse. No one has asked about Hurricane Helene, but let me just make a comment on Hurricane Helene, and I'm sure you all have followed it perhaps more closely than I have. And I'm sure we've all read various comments on this, but I just want to paraphrase one that I've heard. And it was written by, one of the top meteorologists in North Carolina. And about 3 or 4 days afterwards, he published what would amount to an op-ed piece, and that it was out on social media also. And I was just shocked, that a science guy and a very public science guy, that's what meteorologists are. They're very, very public science people. And that he would say, what happened in Asheville and the area around there is impossible. And then he went on. It is inconceivable. He said, this is so far off any expectation based on history that nobody who understands kind of how weather patterns work could possibly have included what actually happened in their fullest range of possibility. In other words, you get out to a 1% likelihood, a 0.5% likelihood. What happened a week and a half ago is outside of that. It's in the area of this cannot have happened. And when you start hearing that, so I live in Vermont, an area of steep hills, not unlike Asheville. And uh, how shall I put it? We are a very progressive setting here. Now, Asheville, there's plenty that's progressive in Asheville, but it's also surrounded by an area that's not so progressive. In any case, Vermont is, there's a lot of progressive people in Vermont, but there's no way, as our own flooding has shown, twice in the past year and a half, we've had 100-year floods. Twice in a year and a half, we've had so-called 100-year floods. It's an absurd concept. Why does America still tolerate the use of the concept 100-year flood or 1,000-year flood? Because that kind of continuity that has those events every 100 years or every 1,000 years, that kind of continuity has nothing to do with where we are living now and where we will be living tomorrow and the next day and 20 years from now and 50 years from now. And somehow that I just wanted to say all of that to you because that's the kind of shift that all of us need to make. And I hardly need to tell you, particularly because I know you're such a sciencey community, how difficult that shift is, because so much of what we expect is rooted in the past, and that is no longer a dependable predictor. Okay, sorry, I went off a little bit on that one, but
Another question.
another question.
As I've waded through these climate issues and actions we can take, I've made a number of lifestyle changes, but I haven't made every lifestyle change I could have made. I am aware of friends and people that probably look down their noses, and I feel terribly guilty if I get on an airplane. I'm assuming that if you had come down here in person, would you have flown down here? And when you do that, and you look at Greta Thunberg, who took a sailing ship across the ocean because she refused to fly, and she's taken that extreme. How do you rationalize the things that the actions you do take and the actions you could still take, and weigh all those pieces together?
Thank you for that question. And there's so many aspects of this question that I appreciate. The first aspect is your own transparency, how you began the question. We need to be more transparent with each other, just as you have just perfectly demonstrated. Secondly, Obama did not originate this expression. I can't tell you who did. Maybe somebody there knows, but I try not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So would it have been a good thing for me to come down there and do 3 presentations in the course of one trip down there? In my own head, sure, that made sense. My wife and I, for a variety of reasons, drove across country last winter. Our son lives on the other coast, and I managed to schedule, I think, 3 presentations along the way in order to speak to the kind of question that you have just asked. I have some friends, like my friend Peter Kalmus. I believe, I don't want to quote this out of context, but I'm pretty sure that he like Greta has said no to flying. But I have other friends, like Catherine Hayhoe, who is, arguably, maybe certainly among the top 5 climate scientists in the world today. And she's an evangelical Christian, in case you don't know. And Catherine Hayhoe will not fly unless she is able to pack if she's going to be there for like 3 days, she might make 15 different presentations, in-person presentations during the 3 days that she's in a different location and then fly home. She was very I don't mean this in any negative way, but she was sort of patting herself on the back for her most recent trip. I'm trying to remember where the heck it was to. I can't remember where it was to, but she's lives in Texas and teaches there in Texas. And she flew somewhere and I think it was it was for New York Climate Week. That was it. She went to New York for Climate Week last week or the week before, and she made 23 presentations during Climate Week. So that she has a much more uh, respectful response. She has more integrity than I do on this issue because she has a bigger reputation than me, and so she's able to get 23 speaking engagements in New York during Climate Week, which I never would be able to. But your question is an important one, and I want to go back to where I began, which is praising you for your transparency. It's, church is a place where we can be transparent about these difficult issues. And so if we take advantage of what is the safety of our congregations in order to be more forthcoming, as you just demonstrated, to be more forthcoming, not just about patting ourselves on the back, but about our failures. I feel really bad that I wasn't able to successfully do this. Has anybody else been able to do it? And could you help me? Then what happens is our collective witness then becomes more significant. So thanks for that question. It's a good one.
We need a Methodist question. We've had too many Presbyterian questions.
They have the Sunday school class.
Questions. First, the time it will take to pollute ourselves out of existence is considerable, and carbon-based pollution, including carbon dioxide, but mostly methane right now, are really important issues. I personally have not seen data suggesting the cost of transition away from fossil fuels over various periods of time. Are you aware of such data?
Yeah. Just to answer that part of your question, the guy to look up, he's a Stanford professor. He has his own institute at Stanford, and his name is Stephen. I think his middle initial is K. Jacobson. And if you just look up him, he over the past 10 years, he started out doing studies state by state in the United States to figure out how quickly could each state, if it were to go all in on a transition, how quickly could each state get rid of fossil fuel and electrify? And then once he completed all the 50 states, he started doing other countries. And the statistics that I was quoting came from him and his studies. And there were a couple of other studies that I quoted as well. And by 2023, he had managed to do, I think it's 160 countries, maybe it was 170 countries in the world, country by country by country, figuring out how quickly could that country transition to wind, water, and solar, and then once you actually do all those studies, the figure that it pays for itself in 6 years is a derivative figure of all of that, because you begin to realize the savings And just to point out just something that's technical, it's not an obvious thing in that when we convert from fossil fuel to electric, it turns out the efficiency, for example, of running a car from a battery, the car to go 60 miles an hour working from a battery requires much less energy from that battery than it does energy from gasoline. And that's because the burning of the gasoline and the inefficiency of the internal combustion engine is much less efficient than the utilization of electricity and the running of an electric engine to propel a car. And the analogies are similar in all forms of electrification. So that's one of the reasons why you get this astonishing figure that it pays for itself in 6 years. But I think you had another part of your question, and I'm sorry that I kind of jumped in there.
I think it answers the technological part of the question. I was worried about the social implications of lost jobs, re-education, closing down properties. I have personally not seen those figures.
And those figures, thank you for saying, gee, show me the facts. Those figures, how shall I put it? They are piecemeal. So depending on location, state by state, or even more broken, even smaller locations, you can find information about this or that project, and occasionally about this or that state. But I'm not aware, to your point, I'm not aware of any massive study that has basically said how this could be accomplished, and has kind of mapped out in detail the possible transitions. And the reason is because it would be so speculative. So, the reality is, and people, this is kind of an astonishing fact that people find hard to believe. But in Texas, for example, more people are employed by renewable energy employment, in terms of particularly wind power, mostly, but also solar installation, than are employed in fossil fuel work. And really? Are you in Texas? Are you kidding me? And sorry, that's just the way it is. And the transition is not always an easy one. It's not the case necessarily that the skills involved in laying pipeline, for example, can be transitioned to assembling wind turbines. But some of those skills are transitionable, for gosh sakes. Of course they are. And it, how shall I put it? A key part of this transition is support from governors of this, that, and the other state, who would have much more oversight over job transition than would the federal government, if you understand what I mean. The context in which the transition takes place is in situ. It's, community by community. It's state by state. So cooperation between sort of federal subsidies or federal redirect, if you will, and government, local government, and state government is an essential part of that transition. That's for sure. I know there are organizations, and I should have them at the tip of my tongue, but I don't. Organizations whose focus, the entire nonprofit organization, is on a just transition. And they have all kinds of statistics, possibly the ones you're asking for, available. But I'm sorry that I just can't give you the name of that organization off the top of my head.
Thank you. The second question is, we've talked, I hear a lot about carbon footprints, and it's my understanding that these have been individualized, and yet what I understand about the situation is that just over 25% of our carbon pollution comes from energy production. About 25% comes from agriculture, and somewhat under 25% comes from industry. So our individual footprints are lost in the last 25%. Can you comment on the idea of not buying a Tesla, but organizing politically to change the agricultural, industrial, and energy legal system now?
So my understanding of those statistics are that what you just quoted is accurate, first. Second, I just want to put a label on what you've just said. On the one hand, there's personal carbon footprint, and then when you're talking about industry and agriculture, and I forget what the third one was, you said these are all the supply side, one way or another. And so in my talk, when I talk about shifting from the demand side, which is over here in terms of personal carbon footprint, and I'll explain that in a minute, shifting from that to the demand side, that's where we have to pay attention. The concept of personal carbon footprint, something we've all heard of, it's hard to imagine. Wait for it. The concept of personal carbon footprint was originated by British Petroleum. And it was intentionally in the memo where the concept was first outlined. It was, we need to shift the guilt for CO2 to individuals. Let's start a movement to make people feel bad about their personal carbon footprint and help them to figure out how they can focus on improving it. And then the implication is, rather than try to put us out of business by solarizing and windizing and everything else. That's a fact. It's like some of this history is just like, really, you can't make this up. You know, the oil company used the same fake scientists as the cancer, producing cigarette companies did. Yeah, same ones. Thanks for those questions.
So we had 2 and maybe 3 Methodist questions there. Do we have another Methodist question? If not, I'll go over to Pete for another Presbyterian question.
This isn't a question, I just wanted to say, I think the professor you're talking about is Mark Z. I said Zebra Jacobs.
Thank you. That's right. It's a Z. Sorry. Yes.
It's Mark, not Steve. It's Mark, not Steve. So I'm gonna finish this up, Jim, with a question of my own. We have here representatives of 2 influential faith communities in Oak Ridge, and I'm sure that having spoken on this topic multiple times, you've inevitably gotten the question, I'm just one person, what can I as an individual do to make a difference? This is a different spin on that question. What can we as 2 congregations here in Oak Ridge do to make a difference?
So thank you, Dan. I love this question. The first thing I've made over 400 of these presentations in my time, right? And only I don't know how many altogether, but not very many of them am I addressing 2 congregations that have come together. And in fewer still have I been addressing more than 2 congregations that have come together. So the first thing is, you're already doing something, and that is you're recognizing, it would be good to cooperate with the congregation down the street, because probably we have better ideas and we certainly have more influence if we come together. So the first thing to do is to applaud what y'all are already doing and what you've been doing for some time with this series on science and religion. But then the next thing to do is I just want to pivot a little bit and say, well, so you have this great history of talking about science and religion, and maybe that should be no surprise since you're in such a sciencey community. But as has happened over the past 4 or 5 years, when the world's climate scientists have begun to redefine the role of the scientist in today's world, given the climate crisis, the role of today's scientists in the world. Scientists, generally speaking, I'm not talking about any individual in the room now, but generally, I come from a family of scientists. I went to Princeton to be a scientist myself. Scientists generally hate to be out, in the public and doing actions, and the idea of civil disobedience, it's unthinkable. And a slight exception to this was after the atomic weapon was developed. The Many of the nuclear scientists got together and formed Pugwash, as some of you are well aware, down in Oak Ridge. And some of you may have even participated in Pugwash, or the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since then. But generally speaking, that crew, some of them, but most of them not, engaged in civil disobedience. A few of them did, but for the most part, they didn't. Something new is happening among scientists today, climate scientists, and that's my setup for saying something new needs to happen among people of faith. For congregations like your two congregations who get it, there's an implied question, and this sort of relates to the question about personal carbon footprint, right? I think everybody realizes, and probably realized before you came into the room today, that personal carbon footprint, that's a sketchy concept. This is a much bigger deal than me getting my act together in terms of my carbon footprint. While that's important, this is a much bigger deal than that. Similarly, the leverage which people of faith, which congregations can, and I believe must have, in order to pivot our climate policy at a pace that can make life tolerable for our children and grandchildren. The necessity of having congregations of all faith perspectives involved in that, it's absolutely huge. So it begs the question, well, our predecessors, I'm not speaking about your particular congregation, though I might be, our predecessors were involved in anti-slavery movement, or they were involved in women's rights movement, the suffragette movement, or they were involved in fighting child labor, or they were involved in the civil rights movement more recently, or in the voting rights movement right after that. If you begin to look back at your history and realize congregations do have a history of being involved, that time is now for congregations to get involved now. So I just think it would be as an extension of what you've already been doing for many years, as an extension of that, to step forward and say, okay, what would it be like? I'll just toss out some examples. What would it be like if our congregations were to generate op-ed pieces on a regular basis in the local papers? And no, you can't say it's the entire congregation recognizing it. And depending on how your congregation's organized, you probably can't have the church council or whatever your equivalent is issue the statement. But a member of the congregation can do it. And the impact on the public would be, wow, this is like a church is beginning to step out on this issue. And that then becomes a model for others. If this has any appeal to you all, Dan, I can send you a link. I'd have to look it up, but in the Washington, D.C. area, there was a rabbi and I think she was a Lutheran minister who wrote an op-ed piece about a year and a half ago, and it was published in the Washington Post. And it just had an incredible impact on people because they didn't expect it. My suspicion is that, there's plenty of work to do in your area, and that cooperation by your congregations, which is already underway, becoming more activist, for lack of a better word, would really make an impact. So that's at least my initial response to your excellent question, Dan.
And as a disclaimer, we didn't practice that in advance, that was off the top of my head. Let's thank Jim for a wonderful presentation. And one of the disadvantages of the Zoom format is that we won't be able to come up to you after the talk and chat your ear off one at a time. So I will close out the recording, and we will be posting that recording on our YouTube channel soon. And when that's available, we'll make the link available to your congregations, our congregation and the UMC congregation, so that you can share it with anyone who might have not been able to be here, but is still interested in watching our presentation. So with that, we're going to let Jim go, and we have munchies and tea and other things, and we can ask questions of each other. So that'll have to do.
Well, thanks so much. This has been a great opportunity together, and I loved your questions. And keep it up. I'll be holding both your congregations in prayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Yeah.